Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Mirza Hashem Mem Ches Amud Beis. We already did a significant part of Mem Ches Amud Beis, but in this year we will be completing the rest of Mem Ches Amud Beis. So we are continuing to learn Hilchas Tefillin, and we pick up today Mem Ches Amud Beis, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Chaf Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Kol Parsha, each parsha of the Tefillin, achar sheyichtevena, after you write it, yikra'ena, you should read it, heitev, very well, bekavana, with intent, in other words, read it carefully, v'dikduk, in great care, pa'amayim v'shalosh, 2 or 3 times. So when you finish writing a parsha, stop, read it over 2 or 3 times. V'yachsar v'yikra'ena, and then you should read it again, kaidem sheyitanena b'soich beisa, before you put it into its bias, kedei shaloi tischalef parsha beparsha, so that you should not risk confusing one parsha with another parsha. Now, this latter halacha is very easy to understand when we speak about a shel rosh. We have the parshas of the shel rosh. They're 4 individual parshios, right? 4 separate pieces of cloth. You finish writing them, you fold them up, you wrap them in gidon. Now they're closed. You can't see which parsha is which. You take them, you put them in a box, and then you go to put them in the bias. You might put the wrong parsha in the wrong bias. So the Mechaber is telling us, when you're ready to insert the parshas in the bias, give it a read, make sure it's the right parsha, then fold it up, wrap it up, tie it up, and then put it into the bias. If you put it aside first, when you're ready to put it into the bias, make sure you read it. Make sure you check which parsha it is before you put it in the bias. Even with the shel yad, because the Mechaber doesn't make a distinction here between the shel yad and the shel rosh, it would seem that even the shel yad, before you take the parsha and put it into the bias of the shel yad, make sure you read it and check that it's the shel yad parsha and not one of the shel rosh parshas. And you might put the wrong parsha, the wrong type of parsha, into the bias of the shel yad. But in any case, the first halacha that the Mechaber said over here is, you write a parsha. When you finish writing the parsha, read it over well, carefully, 2 or 3 times. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Kov Daled, Yikra'ena heitev, read it well. Shem yimtza ezer ois chasar be'ezer parsha, because let's say you wrote the parsha and you goofed when you wrote the parsha, and you left out a letter when you wrote the parsha. Shem yimtza ezer ois chasar be'ezer parsha, if you're missing an ois in the parsha, loi hi lavada nifsala, it's not only that parsha that has the missing letter that's going to be puzzle. Elagam kol shemasha achareh, everything that you write subsequent to that parsha will also be puzzle. Mishum shiyu shaloi kisidran, because everything else will be written shaloi kisidran. Ukadalael bereisha Siman in Sif Aleph, like we saw earlier in the beginning of Siman Lamed Beis in Sif Aleph. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. Let's say you wrote the very first parsha of the Tefillin, you wrote Kadesh. Now, when you review the parsha of Kadesh, let's say you find that you missed a letter. Now, as we're going to see very shortly in Sif Chav Gimel, if you missed a letter, you can't go back and insert the missing letter, right? That letter would be written Shaloi Kisidron. So you can't just go back and insert a missing letter. So if you wrote Kadesh, and you completed the entire parsha of Kadesh, and somewhere in there you missed a letter, the parsha of Kadesh is no good. Now, but not only is the parsha of Kadesh no good, let's say now you went on to write the parsha of V'haya ki yiviyacha. The parsha of V'haya ki yiviyacha, let's say you're dealing with a shel yad. It's all on one cloth, right? When you write the parsha of V'haya ki yiviyacha, since the first parsha of Kadesh is no good, the next parsha of V'haya ki yiviyacha is also not going to be good. So give yourself, take pause between each one of the parshas that you write and review that parsha. Make sure that parsha is okay. If that parsha is okay, then you could continue on to the next parsha. Now we go to Sifchav Beis. Toiv lenasois hakolmus kaidem sheyaschil lichtoiv haparsha. The Mechaber says when you pick up the kolmus, when you pick up the quill to start writing, you should test it out first. Now remember, a quill is not exactly a precision writing instrument. It might be in the hands of a good cipher, it is a precision writing instrument. But what I mean by that is it's not a sophisticated fountain pen with a sophisticated, finely crafted ink delivery system. It's a very, very primitive writing instrument in the hands of a good cipher who cuts the quill properly and knows how to write and use the quill well. He could write beautifully, but it is a primitive ink delivery system. Therefore, says the Mechaber, before you start writing, you should test the kolmus. Don't just dip the kolmus and start writing. Toiv lenasais hakolmus, it would be good to test out the kolmus kaidem sheyaschel lichtoiv a parsha before you begin writing a parsha of Tefillin. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us it's not only when you begin writing a parsha, but each time you begin writing, each time you dip the quill, you should test the quill first, so that you don't have too much ink on the quill and create a problem. Don't dip the quill and then just start writing right away. It's altogether possible that you have too much ink on the tip of the quill and you might, deposit a blob of ink on the cloth. So test out the kolmus after you dip it before you begin writing. V'chein, similarly, says the Mechaber, Yizayer, you should take care, Kaidim sheyichtayv kol shem, before you write the Shem Hashem, likrois kol masha kosav. Before you write the Shem Hashem, read everything that you wrote in that parsha up until the Shem Hashem. Why? Kedei shelo yavayu lidei geniza al yadoi, so that if there's a mistake, this cloth should not have to be put into geniza by the fact that you wrote the Shem. What the Mechaber means over here, this is going to be spelled out in the Mishnah Berurah, what the Mechaber means is like this. Let's say you're writing, let's make it very simple. You're writing Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So Shema Yisrael is one of the parshas of Tefillin. From Shema till the end of the Ahavta is one of the parshas of Tefillin. So let's say you're about to write the parsha of Shema for Shel Rosh. So you write Shema, Shin, Mem, Ayin. Yisrael, Yud, Sin, Reish, Aleph, Lamed. Now you're about to write the Shem. Now, says the Mechaber, before you write the Shem, go check out what you wrote in Tol the Shem. So you wrote Shema, you wrote Yisrael, you're about to write the Shem. Go back and check the Shema Yisrael before you write the Shem. Why? Because here's the thing. If you write Shema Yisrael, and let's say you see that you left out a letter. You wrote Shin Mem Ayin, then when you were writing Yisrael, you wrote Yud Sin Reish Lamed, and you skipped the Aleph. At this point in time, there's still a way to fix the parsha. How? You can't just insert an Aleph. If you insert an Aleph, first of all, how are you going to have room? But even, let's say, technically speaking, you had enough space between the Reish and the Lamed to somehow insert an Aleph. Can't do that because it would be Shaloi Kisidron. You would be writing the Aleph after you already wrote the Lamed. So how can you fix this parsha? The way you could fix it is take a razor blade and scratch out the Lamed. Right? You wrote Yisrael, Yud Sin Reish Lamed. But you need an Aleph after the Reish. And the Aleph that comes after the Reish has to be written Kisidron. So it has to come before the writing of everything that comes after that Aleph. But you already wrote a Lamed. So what could you do? What you could do is you could take a razor blade, scratch away the Lamed, erase the Lamed. Now the Lamed is gone. Now write an Aleph, and then continue writing. Then write the Lamed. But that Eitzah only works if you did not yet write the Shem that comes after the Lamed. Right? Shema Yisrael Hashem. If you already wrote the Shem, now what? You can't erase the Shem. That's the Isser of Bechikas Hashem. So you can't, once you wrote the shame, now there's no way to fix this parsha. Because you can't erase the shame. You can't insert the aleph that comes before the shame, or erase the limud from Yisrael and then put it an aleph and then a limud, because it's written Shaloi Kisidron. You wrote the shame before you wrote the end of the word Yisrael. So the point over here is, once you write the shame, ein lo takana. Once you write the shame, there's no way to save the parsha. Therefore, says the Mechaber, before you write the shame, recheck everything that came before the shame. So that if you have to erase, you could erase and then fix and write Kisidron and then write the shame. Now there's much discussion amongst the Mefarshim over here. Each time you write the shame, what do you have to go back and check? Go back to the beginning of the parsha and check? That's what it sounds like over here from the Mechaber, right? The Mechaber says, Koidim sheyichtov kol shem likrois kol ma shekosav. You should write everything that came before it. Now, it seems that there's really no reason that you should have to check everything that came before the previous shame, right? Let's say you wrote Shema Yisrael Hashem, right? So you wrote Shema Yisrael. Now you stop and you checked Shema Yisrael. Now you write Hashem. That's the shame. Now you write Elokeinu, another shame. Now you write Hashem, another shame. Now you write Echad. Then you write Ve'ahavta Ace. Now you're up to another shame. Why do you have to go back to Shema? You checked Shema before you wrote the first shame in the first pasuk of Shema. So there doesn't seem to be any reason to go all the way back to Shema Yisrael. What you should have to go back to is to Echad, right? You're up to Ve'ahavta Ace Hashem. So check Ace, check Ve'ahavta, check Echad, and now you're back up to Elokeinu. From Elokeinu and back to the beginning, you don't have to check. You already checked all of that before you wrote those shemos. So some Mefarshim say that you only have to check from the previous shame up to the shame that you're up to now. So that if you find a mistake, you can erase everything up to that shame and then fix it and rewrite it Kisidron. But there's no reason to go back beyond that. In any case, let's just read this again over here. So the Mechaber said, "V'chein yizar koidim sheyichtov kol shem likrois kol ma shekasav kidei shelo yavayu lidei geniza." Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Kofhei. The Mechaber said, before you start writing, you should test the quill. You should test the komus. Eis Katan Kofhei koidim sheyaschil. Before you start writing, Eina writes a loymar betchilas haparsha dafka. The Mechaber doesn't mean that just when you're starting to write a parsha, you should test the quill. But then for the rest of the parsha, you never have to test it again. That's not what he means. Ella kaidim sheyaschil lichtov beha parsha. Even in the middle of the parsha. The point is, every time you dip the quill, you should test the quill again before you start writing. Eis Katan Kovav, the Mechaber said that before you write a shame, you should check Masha Kosav. You should check what you wrote before that shame. Ba'oisa Parsha. The Mishnah Berurah says that you should check everything that came before the shame in that Parsha. V'loi hashalafaneha, but you do not have to check the previous Parsha. Makes sense. After you finished writing the previous Parsha, you already checked the whole previous Parsha 2 or 3 times before you started writing the next Parsha. So you don't have to keep on going back and rechecking the previous parshas. So you start writing. When you get up to the shame, you go back and you check everything up until that shame. Then you write the shame. Then you write to the next shame. Before you write the next shame, either you check from the beginning of the parsha to that shame, or from the last shame, the previous shame, to that shame. And you keep writing that way until you get to the end of the second parsha. When you get to the end of the second parsha, you're supposed to go back and review the second parsha 2 or 3 times before you start writing the third parsha. Now you go into the third parsha. You start writing the third parsha. When you get up to the shame, you check that whole parsha from the beginning up into the shame, and so on and so forth. Eis Katan Kov Zayin. The reason we check everything that came before the shame, before we wrote the shame, the Mechaber said, was so that the parsha should not come lidei geniza al yodoi, so that you shouldn't have to bury it, you shouldn't have to put it into geniza because of the writing of the shame. Says the Mishnah Berurah here, ukeshetoival hakolmas lichtov by es hashem. When you dip a quill into ink in order to write the shame. Now let's put this in perspective. Remember that we learned already previously, before you write the shame, you have to say l'shem kedushas Hashem, right? But when you dip a quill in order to write the shame, lo yaschel lichtov oisai miyad. You should not right away start with the writing of the shame. Shalo yasidenu beriboy dioi. First of all, we don't want to risk messing up the shame by having too much ink on the quill, which is the problem that we mentioned earlier, which is why you're always supposed to test the quill before you start writing. But there's another problem. Ula yeshalav seyar, maybe there's going to be a little hair or a dust particle stuck to the tip of the quill. And now when you start writing the shame, it won't come out nice because of debris that's stuck on the tip of the kolmus. So the Mishnah Berurah is saying a rule over here, and he's not saying it on his own. He's bringing this down, Eis Kov Zion, in the Sharet Zion. He's bringing this down from Hilchas Sefer Torah, Yeridei Reish Ayin Vav Siv Daled. He says, don't dip the quill and start writing the shame right away. First of all, there might be too much ink on the quill. Second of all, there might be some kind of debris stuck to the tip of the quill, which will make that when you'll write the shame, it won't come out nice. And now there's another interesting reason that he brings down over here from the Sefer Bar Sha'amar. The Gam, and also, Mishum Shetzarech Lekadesh Hadiyoi Sha'al HaKolmus Terem Sheyichtov Hashem. Before you write the Shem Hashem, you have to be Mekadesh, the ink that's on the kolmus. You can't just write the Shem Hashem with stam ink. You have to sanctify the ink. You have to be Mekadesh, the ink that's on the kolmus, before you start writing the Shem. How do you do that? How do you Mekadesh the ink? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Lachein, therefore, Yechavein, you should pay attention and you should have intent. Lahaniach ois achas milichtov koidem Hashem. Before you write the shame, you should leave out one letter that comes before the shame. So you're writing ve'ahavta eis Hashem. So write ve'ahavta, then write the aleph from eis, and leave over the suf. Then dip the ink in the kolmus, and now dip the kolmus in the ink, and now use the kolbus to write the suf of ace. What will that accomplish? First of all, if there's any problem with ribuy dioi, it'll come out on the suf, and you could always scratch away that suf. You could always erase it and rewrite it. Also, by writing the suf of ace, when you write the suf of ace, you're writing an ois in tefillin. That's mikadesh the dioi that's on the kolmus. By writing a letter in tefillin, you're sanctifying all of the ink that's on the kolmus. Now you could go into the yud of the shame with ink that's already mekudesh, with sanctified ink. So fascinating. So Yechavin la'aniach ois achas milichtov koidem Hashem. Leave out one letter that comes before the shame. In our example, the suf of ace. And start writing with that letter. So write the suf, and then go into Yud Kei Vav Kei. V'im loy asakain. Now let's say you didn't do that. Let's say you already wrote ace, and now you're up to the shame, and you need more ink on the quill. So you dip the kolmus. What do you do now? Right? Maybe it's not mekudesh. In loy asakain yechapes achar ois oitag. You should look back at what you wrote and look for a letter or a tag, one of the crowns on the letters, shetzricha dioi, that still needs a little bit of ink, v'yamalena, and fill it in, v'kaisev es Hashem, and then write the shame. So what's the Mishnah Berurah suggesting? He's saying like this: you wrote ve'ahavta ace, now you have to write the shame. But you also have to re-dip the kolmus. So you're going to re-dip the kolmus, but we don't want you to just start writing the yud of the shem. Maybe there's too much ink on the quill. Also, it's not mekudesh. Maybe there's a hair or some other dust or something on the tip of the quill. But you forgot to leave out the stuff that came before the shem. So what do? Says the Mishnah Berurah, what you do is go back, look for a letter that's already written. So there's no problem of kisidron. You're not going back and now writing a letter that wasn't written or completing a letter that wasn't complete. If you did that, you would have a kisidron problem. No. You go back and you find a letter that's written, kedasu kedin, but it's not 100% perfect. It can use a little bit more ink. So now, use the quill to add in that little bit of additional ink that the letter could use. It's not possible, but it could use a little ink. By doing that, you mekadesh the ink on the kolmus. That also serves as a way of testing the kolmus to make sure that there isn't too much diyai. It also serves as a way of testing the kolmus to make sure that there's no dust or a hair on the tip of the kolmus that will cause the shem not to come out properly. And when you finish doing that, then go to where you're up to the shem and write the shem. Continues the Mishnah Berurah over here in Oiskat and Kovzayin. V'im tzarech diyai kaidim sheyigmar hashem. Let's say now you wrote the yud of the shem, you wrote the hey of the shem, and you realize you don't have enough ink on the kolmus. So now you really have to re-dip the kolmus. What should you do? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Oz yitpal ba'oisiyos shelifnei Hashem shehem lachin adayin. So you have a problem now. You wrote the yud and the hey of the shem. You still have to write another vav and another hey. You're out of ink. We don't want you to go back to the inkwell and dip the quill again, because now you're going to have the problem of the ink not being mekudesh. You're going to have the problem of testing out the quill. All these problems are going to come back. So says the Mishnah Berurah, you know what you should do? Instead of dipping the quill in the inkwell, go back to, let's say, V'ahavta. If you just wrote V'ahavta, the ink on the letters of V'ahavta might still be wet. And if they're still wet, just by dipping the point of the quill in the wet ink of V'ahavta might give you enough ink to finish the shem. And that ink is already mekudesh. It was used already to write tefillin. It's already mekudesh. You're not going to run into the problem of having too much ink on the quill, because that's only when you dip it in the inkwell. Over here, you're not dipping it in the inkwell, you're just dipping it into a wet letter. That's not going to give you too much ink. So that's the eitzah, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you run out of ink in middle of the shem. Aval, however, continues the Chavetz Chaim, lo yitbal ba'oisiyos hashem atzman. If you're up to the vav in Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, don't dip the tip of the quill in the ink, in the wet ink of the hay of the shem, and use that to continue writing the shem, because that's a bazayin. The ink that was already put down on the klaf to form the letters of the shem, you don't use that to go ahead and write further. Also, by doing that, you're risking mechikas Hashem. Maybe if you stick the tip of the quill in the wet ink of the hay or the yud, maybe you'll rub it out, and that would be mechikas Hashem. However, it says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh makilin, there are those that make a litbal ba'oisiyos Hashem atzman, and do allow you to dip the tip of the quill into the wet letters of the shem itself. Debizoy leka, because it's not considered a bazayin of the shem, kevichu kidei lahashlim b'yas Hashem, because you're using that ink to complete the shem. So it's not a bazayin to take ink from the yud and the hay of the shem in order to continue writing the shem. Now, what do you do if there are no wet letters before where you're writing? So then you have no choice. You have to dip the quill into the inkwell. But but then what you should do is you should look for a letter that needs a little extra ink, and you should use it over there first in order to be mekadesh the diyai and in order to test the kolmus. And of course, all of these things, they're mitzvahs but they're not li'ikuva. If you don't do this, if you dip the kolmas into the quill right before you write the shame, and you don't test it, and you're not mekadosh the dioi or anything else, and you write the shame, the tefillin are kosher. As long as you say, you have to say l'shem kedushas Hashem, but the tefillin are kosher. Okay, now we go to Sif Chav Gimel, which sheds a little light on what we said until now. Says the Mechaber, Im matza shechiser ois achas. So again, you're writing the Parsha. So you wrote Shema Yisrael, and now you're up to Hashem. Before you write the Shem, you go back and you check. You Shin Mem Ayin, Yud Sin Reish, and then you see you skip the Aleph. Yud Sin Reish Lamid, you skip the Aleph. What do? Says the Mechaber, Im matza shechiser ois achas. If when you go back you see that you skipped a letter in the Parsha, ein loy takana. There's no way to be mesakin it. There's no way to fix the Parsha by inserting a letter. She'im kain, because if you try to insert the letter, hayu kisuvin shaloi kisidron, then it would be written shaloi kisidron upsulin, and then the Parsha would be puzzle. Mishum diksiv, because it says in the pasuk v'hayu l'taitafa ispein enecha, and we dash it from there v'hayu adavarim ha'ele, and we learn out from there v'hayu b'haviyason yehu. They have to be v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele, and these words should be. And we dash in v'hayu means b'haviyason yehei. The way they are in the Torah, that's the way they must be. So the way they're written in the Torah chronologically, that's the way they have to be written in the Tefillin. They have to be written kisidron. They have to be written in order. So if you skip the letter, says the Mechaber, there's no way to fix it by just going back and inserting the missed letter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein loy takana b'hashlama. You can't fix it by completing it. In other words, by completing the missing letter that you missed. You can't just go back and insert the missing letter. Now, explains the Mishnah Berurah that when the Mechaber says there's ein loy takana, there's no takana, umayri, he's talking about a case, shemikan at soifa parsha, that from the point of the missing letter until the end of the parsha, yesh shemay she'enam nimchakin. You already wrote the Shem of Hashem that's not allowed to be erased. So again, you know what we're talking about here? We're talking about you wrote Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad ve'ahavta eis Hashem. And now you go back and you see that you missed a letter in ve'ahavta. Now you're up a creek without a paddle. What are you going to do? You can't go back and insert the missing letter in ve'ahavta. It would be written Shaloi Kisidron. You also can't erase from where you're up to back to the missing letter in ve'ahavta, put in the missing letter and write further. Why? Because you already wrote Hashem. You already wrote ve'ahavta eis Hashem. And the shame can't be erased. So now you're stuck. Now there's no way to fix this parsha. Like the Mishnah Berurah says here, in the end of Eis Katan Kuf Ches, the ilav hachi, because if we're not talking about a case where you already wrote the shame, then there is a way to fix it. Yigrar ad sofa. Let's say you skipped the hey in ve'ahavta. So you wrote vav aleph, you skipped the hey, and you wrote a vase, and then you wrote a tuf. So you wrote ve'avta, ace, but you didn't write the shame yet. So now there's still a way to fix it. Erase the suf, erase the aleph, erase from the end of the word ve'ahavta until the aleph of ve'ah, and then continue writing. Write a hey, write a vase, write a tuf, and keep on writing kisidron. So when the Mechaber says that if you skip the letter, there's no eitzah, there's no way to be masakin it, that means he's talking about a case where from the point where you missed the letter and you continued writing, you already wrote a shame. Now you're up a creek because you can't erase the shame. Ois Kad Koftes, Bav Yosan Yehu. We darshan v'hayu advarim ha'ela. We darshan Bav Yosan Yehu. They have to be the way that they are in the Sefer Torah. Pirish, that means Kesedish and Ichtavais B'Torah Yuksuvin. The way they appear in the Torah Kedosha, that's the order in which they must be written. Now we go back into the Mechaber, 3 lines up from the bottom, last 2 words on the line. So in the beginning of Sif Chav Gimel, we covered what happens if you missed a letter. Now says the Mechaber, V'im yiter ois achas. Let's say you wrote an extra letter. So you go back and you check, and you see that you wrote Ahavta, you wrote Vav, Aleph, Aleph, Hey, Vez, Tuf. So you wrote an extra letter in Ahavta. What do you do now? So Yiter Oisachas, if you inserted an extra letter, Yesh Loi Takana. That is a way to fix. Al Yidei Yigrar Oisa, you could erase the extra letter. Right? Then you don't have a problem of Shaloi Kisidron. Now I'm going to change the case a little and you'll see why. You wrote the Ahavta Ace, and you left out the Tuf of the Ahavta. So you wrote Vav, Aleph, Hey, Vez. I'm sorry, you didn't leave it out. You wrote a double letter. You wrote the Ahavta, and you wrote 2 Tufs at the end. Vav, Aleph, Hey, Vez, Tuf, Tuf. And then you wrote Ace. Now you're about to write the Shem. So you go back and you check. Oh my goodness, I wrote an extra Tuf in V'ahavta. Says the Mechaber, there's an Eitzah. Take your X-Acto knife and scratch away, erase the extra Tuf at the end of V'ahavta. Now, is there a problem of Kisidron? No. You wrote everything in order. You're not writing in a letter now that wasn't written Kisidron. You wrote everything Kisidron. You're removing a letter. So what? No problem. So says the Mechaber, V'im yiter oisachas yesh loy takana, al yidei sheyigra roisa. You could erase the double letter, but there's a caveat, there's a catch. Im hi b'soif teva oibet chilosa. You can only do that if the extra letter is either at the beginning of at the end of a word, or at the beginning of the word. So in the case that I just gave you, you could do it. You have a double Tuf at the end of V'ahavta, you could erase the second Tuf. And now what'll be? You'll have a little bit of a bigger gap between the word V'ahavta and Ace. So what? Big deal. Or you wrote a double Aleph in the beginning of the word Ace. V'ahavta Ace. You wrote Aleph Aleph Saf. It's okay. Erase the first Aleph. So you'll have a big gap between V'ahavta and Ace. So what? That's okay. So there's an Eitzah al Yidei Sheyigra Roisa imi b'soif teva oibet chilasa. However, imi be'emtza teva, but if it's in the middle of the word, like the first case that I gave you, you wrote V'ahavta and you wrote 2 Alephs. You wrote Vav, Aleph, Aleph, Hey, Vez, Tuf. Over there you have a problem. Because what are you going to do? You're going to erase one of the Alephs? Can't do that. If you have an extra letter in the middle of a word, you can't fix it. Why? Because when you erase the duplicated letter, now it's going to look like 2 words. So if you have the Ahavta with a double Aleph, and you wrote Vav Aleph Aleph, and now you erased the second Aleph. So now you're going to have Vav Aleph, a space, Vez Tuf. That doesn't look like V'ahavta. It looks like V'ahavta. 2 separate words. That's wrong. So that you can't do. So this Eitzah of erasing an extra letter only works if the extra letter is either at the beginning of the word or at the end of the word. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Kuf Yud. Ois Achas. That's if you have 1 extra letter, a duplicated letter. V'im kosav teva yisera. Let's say you have an extra word. You wrote V'ahavta Ace, Ace, and now you're about to write the Shem. So you have, or that's not such a good example. You'll see why. V'ahavta Ace Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha uv'chol nafshecha. So you wrote b'chol levavecha uv'chol nafshecha. So you have b'chol levavecha, and after levavecha is supposed to become uv'chol, and then nafshecha. But you wrote uvechol twice. So between levavacha and nafshecha, you have the word uvechol that appears twice. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you wrote an extra word, yigrarena, erase the duplicated word. And leave the space of one uvechol, you'll leave that space on the cloth blank. So you'll have a blank space over there. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here in the brackets, that's okay. Im ein loy oisiyos me'atevos shalafanea sheyil yuchal hamshichan b'makam ahu. You could do that b'diavad, but what would be better would be, let's say you wrote b'chol levavacha uvechol nafshecha, and you wrote uvechol. So the last letter of levavacha is a chaf seifis. So you wrote b'chol levavacha uvechol. You could erase the first uvechol and then extend the gag of the chaf seifis at the end of levavacha to fill up the space. Now you got to be careful because you might also have to extend the regel of the chaf seifis. Otherwise, you mess up the proportions and it might look like a resh or a dalet. So it gets tricky. But the point of the Mishnah Berurah is he's saying like this: you have a double letter. You could erase the duplicated letter and leave a blank space on the cloth. But what would be better is if you have a letter that comes before the blank space or after the blank space, which is the type of letter that could be extended and made very big, like a resh or a dalid or a hey. Fill up the space by extending the letter. Ve'ena cholak paisel, but blank space doesn't paisel the parsha. Caveat: kol she'ein b'mekaymai kishir harevach shebein parsha leparsha shu kidei teisha oisiyos. As long as the blank space on the cloth is not the size of 9 letters. If it's the size of 9 letters, then the blank space is a problem because now it's not one continuous parsha. Now you have a break in the parsha. But sometimes you could solve the problem even if the word that you're going to take out is going to create a space of 9 oisiyos. That would probably have to be a case where you have more than one duplicated letter. You have a word, that's not written twice, maybe it's written 3 times. What would be the takana if the space is too big? If you could take the last letter of the word that comes before the space and you could make it big, so that you reduce the blank space to less than 9 letters. Because if it's bigger than that, it would pass over the tefillin. What he means is like this. Let's say you had a word that ended in a hey, and now you have an empty space after that word. You want to fill it up with the hey. Well, the way to do that is to extend the gag, extend the roof of the hay. But if you extend the roof of the hay, you can end up with a very strange hay, because the roof of the hay is going to end over here, but the little regel of the hay is going to be back here, right? Because you wrote a normal-sized hay. You wrote a normal-sized hay. You wrote a normal hay. Now you want to extend the gag of the hay so that it should fill up empty space where you had to erase a duplicated letter. So fine. So you're going to do that. You're going to extend the gag of the hay. But where's the regel of the hay? The little left-hand regel of the hay is all the way back here. So you end up with a very strange-looking hay where the little regel, the little left-hand regel of the hay is not under the end of the gag where it normally is. Instead, it's under the middle of the gag. Says the Mishnah Berurah b'diavad, that is not a problem. Ain't paid b'diavad. Continues the Chofetz Chaim, the Kosav of Pri Begadah, the Pri Begadah writes, to B'teva Kfula, that if you do have this case of a duplicated letter, Toiv Yoiser Limchoi Kashnia. So if you wrote V'ahavta Eis Hashem Elokecha B'chol B'chol, and now you want to erase one of the duplicated B'chols, erase the second one, not the first one. Leave the first one. Why? Teteva Rishona Kadin Nichtav. Because the first one was written properly, right? You wrote V'ahavta Eis Hashem Elokecha B'chol. So you wrote that first B'chol Kedin. It's exactly where it's supposed to be. The second B'chol was not written Kedin. It didn't belong there. So don't erase the first one and leave the second one. Better erase the second one and leave the first one. But in a situation where erasing the first one and leaving the second one would be preferential, because the word before the first of the duplicated letters ends in a letter that could be extended to fill up the blank space, in that case, then it's best to erase the first of the duplicated words, so that you could fill up the space, the empty space, and be choshish for the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, who holds the share parsha hu shloisha oisiyos, that an empty gap of 3 oisiyos creates a problem. Not 9, 3. So to take care of the Rabbeinu Tam, we want you to fill up the space. So better erase the first one. Okay, we're going to stop over here, and we will continue next time with Eis Kat and Kof Yod Aleph from the Mishnah Berurah. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should say, Yeshua Sefus, Parnasset Shidduchim, to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Koil Tzedek, B'mehera V'yameinu. Amen. Be well.